This video series will summarise some of the scientific points of the statement of claim for the COVID-19 vaccine injury class action filed in March of 23 in the Federal Court of Australia. These videos are for informational purposes only, to assist the public in understanding some of the facts presented in the statement of claim. Importantly, the allegations relating to the cause of action, that is that the respondent's approval and ongoing approval of the COVID-19 vaccines constituted negligence and/or misfeasance and led to or contributed to the injuries and deaths after vaccinations. Importantly, that claim is an allegation only and is currently before the Federal Court and yet to be determined. Signal evaluation and causality. The TGA has provided a detailed explanation of their signal evaluation process. For example, this provided in response to questions on notice from Senator Ralph Babet. The TGA is responsible for investigating safety signals for medicines and vaccines. Once a potential signal is detected, the TGA carefully considers available evidence to validate, prioritise, characterise and investigate it. Potential signals are reviewed and assessed by a team of clinical evaluators that considers several factors which may include, but are not limited to, consideration of whether the signal has been assessed previously or whether it's adequately described in the product information, a detailed assessment of individual adverse event reports, reviewing the number of relevant adverse event reports to the TGA's adverse event management system, trends in reporting over time, assessment of the reporting rate of the adverse events using the Australian Immunisation Register dose data, and, where possible, undertaking an observed versus expected analysis to see the observed number of events and if it differs from the expected background rate of events, a review of the published literature, a review of the safety update reports or signal analyses from sponsors, an assessment of the epidemiological evidence of a causal relationship between the vaccine and the adverse event. And this considers factors such as the temporal relationship between vaccination and the onset of an event, the biological plausibility, the known epidemiology of the condition, and whether information observed is consistent with what has been published, or if similar adverse events have been seen with other vaccines. And this process is further detailed in the WHO Handbook of Causality Assessment, and we will return to this later. The TGA goes on to state that if the TGA's investigation confirms a safety issue is potentially linked to a medicine or a vaccine, prompt regulatory action is taken, including communicating what is known about the issue to health professionals and consumers. And we will take a look at a few of the signals that were identified and then dismissed using the Periodic Safety Update Report number 3 for the Pfizer product, dated August of 2022, and using the TGA's recently released questions on notice from Senator Babet describing the signals that they have evaluated. And a quick point regarding the Periodic Safety Update Report. I requested from the TGA on several occasions the PSUR documents, but was refused on the basis that these reports were too voluminous. This report, the third safety update, was obtained by the public health and medical professionals for transparency in the USA. And many listeners may be aware of the controversy around the release of this and other documents. The PHMPT group tried to obtain these documents from the FDA by FOI, as I did. They ended up taking the FDA to court to request the release. And for whatever reason, Pfizer decided to adjoin themselves to the matter to assist the FDA in resisting the release. And this was the much publicised court hearing whereby the FDA requested 75 years to release this data. So going to the Periodic Safety Update Report number 3, which covers the interval from the 19th of December 2021 to 18 June 2022. We read firstly that Japan had required a change in the product information to include Guillain-Barré syndrome in the risk management plan. We also read that during the reporting period, the following signals were addressed: appendicitis, hemolytic anemia, uveitis, exacerbation or flare of an underlying autoimmune disease or inflammatory disorders, capillary leak syndrome, corneal graft rejection, vasculitis, cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, lymphocytic colitis, chronic urticaria, polymyalgia rheumatica, subacute thyroiditis, cerebral vascular accident or stroke, amenorrhea, heavy menstrual bleeding, loss of or altered taste or smell, irritability, myocarditis and pericarditis, and hearing loss. We also read a summary of the signals identified from PSUR number 2, including multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children and adults, vaccine-associated enhanced disease, sudden sensorineural hearing loss, tinnitus, glomerulonephritis and nephrotic syndrome, autoimmune hepatitis, dizziness, acquired haemophilia, and IgA nephropathy. I think many doctors and the public might be very surprised, as I was, to discover that these signals had been identified by mid-2022 and that Pfizer had been requested by various international regulatory agencies to respond to those signals. Perhaps none of us will be particularly surprised to learn that Pfizer almost universally determined these were in fact not confirmed safety signals, using a variety of justifications. We also read the EMA, or European Medicines Agency, requested a review of the published literature, reporting sudden sensorineural hearing loss, multisystem inflammatory syndrome, and also requested that Pfizer present all relevant literature concerning the safety of Comirnaty that is published during the reporting period. Certainly this would be a large task given the volume of published literature reporting adverse events. For example, React-19 presents a database of over 3,000 such publications for the COVID vaccines. And it was stated that in general, the MAH or Pfizer should perform more effort at presenting or evaluating the cases that they have considered to be confounded, and should present the risk factors for developing the respective conditions. And further, that if patient groups or patients with underlying disease have a higher risk of developing the condition, that this information is important to communicate. This is a very important point. Essentially, they're saying that if Pfizer is concluding that these potential signal event reports are due to another underlying condition in that patient, then they need to provide more detail on case evaluations. And if an underlying condition might make someone more susceptible to an adverse event, then this needs to be included in the product information for doctors and the public. So some further comments on the analysis. Data is presented for a homologous booster series cohort with a number of serious events reported in at least 2% of cases. And these include pneumonia, appendicitis, atrial fibrillation, cerebral vascular accident or stroke, and prostate cancer. And I want to just pause and make a few comments on how this sort of information, the clinical trial and post-marketing surveillance data, would usually be presented to doctors and the public, and that is through the approved product information. And the product information is a document produced by the regulator and the sponsor as a jointly authored document. The European Medicines Agency provides the guidelines for this document, which are adopted by many of the regulators, including the TGA. And so there is a section on side effects or undesirable effects. And this section is required to include all adverse reactions if there is a reasonable possibility of a causal relationship. And some examples are shown here, with both summaries of events and special warnings are to be included, a summary of the risk management plan, and a table of all adverse events reported. And further information should be included about rare events or reactions reported, even if the underlying mechanism has not been identified. So from this one table in the PSUR3, pneumonia, appendicitis, atrial fibrillation, cerebrovascular accident or stroke, and prostate cancer should have been included in the product information as commonly reported potential adverse events following the booster, even if a causal relationship has not yet been confirmed. And this is so that doctors and patients are aware that these events are being reported, which helps us to recognise these events as a possible adverse reactions and to make sure these events are then correctly reported to the TGA. Now, I would say first of all that I have seen all of these events after the vaccines in patients that I have first-hand clinical knowledge of. And I would also say that most doctors would have no idea that these events had been commonly reported to Pfizer and were part of a signal evaluation. And perhaps one reason is that the product information does not include any reference to any of these events. We then read in the PSUR that dehydration was assessed as related and that abortion spontaneous or miscarriage was assessed as related by the investigator, but as has been a common theme, the sponsor determined this instead to be unrelated, and the overall conclusion by Pfizer is, much per usual, that based on the review of the cases, no new safety issues were identified. We are also given the following information on the post-authorization data for the homologous booster data subset, that from just over 47,000 cases reported, there were 550 cases reporting a fatal outcome. And of these deaths, the following causes of death were reported more than 20 times: for COVID-19, vaccination failure, cardiac arrest, COVID pneumonia, sudden death, cardiorespiratory arrest, cardiac failure, myocardial infarction, cerebral hemorrhage, and pulmonary embolism. For 99 cases, limited information regarding the cause of death was provided. So we do not know precisely the fatality per dose rate, but these results strongly speak to the following. Firstly, it is evidence against the claim of prevention of severe disease and death, as from a fairly limited number of adverse event cases of 47,000, there were 194 cases of death due to COVID or COVID pneumonia. And the listener might recall that these vaccines are supposed to prevent against contracting COVID at all, and certainly we were all told that they were highly effective against prevention of severe disease and death. So these high numbers of reports of death due to COVID, vaccination failure, and COVID pneumonia in vaccinated and boosted patients, which is potential evidence for VAED or vaccine-associated enhanced disease, and VAED was one of the key post-marketing evaluation requirements for the sponsor. And of course, deaths reported as sudden death or for cardiac arrest, cerebral hemorrhage and myocardial infarction ought to have been included in the product information and disclosed to doctors and the public, and ought to have been thoroughly investigated. I will review now a couple of the safety signal evaluations. Firstly, appendicitis, and this is determined by Pfizer not to be a confirmed risk. It is stated that the placebo-controlled clinical trial data from the Pfizer trial did not reveal any meaningful difference between the vaccine and placebo groups, when in fact the Pfizer clinical trial demonstrated a doubling of the risk of appendicitis in the vaccinated group. Pfizer further states that a plausible mechanism by which the vaccine could cause appendicitis is unknown, when published literature demonstrates an association with appendicitis and SARS-CoV-2 infection, noting increased ACE2 expression throughout the intestinal mucosa, which provides a biologically plausible mechanism for the spike protein produced after vaccination to cause intestinal inflammation. There have in fact been numerous reports of appendicitis made to the TGA as shown here, and I have taken this snip from the opendan.info website, which is an excellent user-friendly database produced by dedicated volunteers and presents data from the TGA DAEN database and related Freedom of Information data. We also see proportionality reporting ratios for appendicitis released under FOI of well over 7, and here we see in response to Senator Babette's question on notice that the TGA reports to have evaluated appendicitis and by some undisclosed logic determined no safety signal. Cerebrovascular accident or stroke, and this is determined by Pfizer that a causal association between the vaccine and hemorrhagic and ischemic stroke could not be concluded and the signal was closed. This signal was actually identified by the TGA and Pfizer was requested to investigate. And so Pfizer reports their database contained 8,934 cases of stroke up to December of 21. For some reason, they do not provide the number of reports for the PSUR reporting period to June of 2022. Pfizer further describes the published literature and reports 2 case studies that found an increased risk of ischemic stroke after the first dose of the Pfizer vaccine. Pfizer also reports a study that found an increased risk of hemorrhagic stroke after Pfizer. And Pfizer then states that one of the authors said that the risk is much higher with COVID, and that these authors emphasised the importance of vaccination, and also that there were several studies that did not find any increase in strokes. They further state the medical literature did not provide a plausible mechanism for how the vaccines could increase the risks of strokes. It is an unexplained mystery that Pfizer would justify increased reports of stroke by stating the risk is worse with COVID disease, and then to state that there is no biological mechanism for stroke from the vaccine, when it is irrefutable that any condition potentially caused by coronavirus can equally and plausibly be caused by the self-produced spike protein from vaccination, as it is the spike protein that is the pathological protein by which the coronavirus causes COVID-19 disease. And there are again hundreds of reports of strokes and over 100 deaths reported to the TGA, and proportionality reporting ratios for ischemic and hemorrhagic strokes are shockingly high, and yet the TGA reports their safety signal evaluation has been completed and returned to routine monitoring. And again, the logic for this conclusion is undisclosed by the TGA. A similar theme follows for all of the signals. Importantly, detailed data on reports of death to Pfizer are only made available for the confirmed signals of myocarditis and pericarditis. And concerningly, we see multiple reports of fatalities due to myocarditis, including a 6-year-old male with cardiac arrest and myocarditis, an 11-year-old female with cardiorespiratory arrest, acute cardiac failure and myocarditis, a 13-year-old male with cardiac failure and myocarditis, a 13-year-old male with cardiac arrest, multi-organ disorder, ventricular tachycardia and myocarditis, a 13-year-old female with myocarditis, and several more tragically deceased young people, people who were aged in their 20s and 30s, and this horror of a list goes on. This is at least somewhat more transparent than our TGA, where we have multiple young children who are reported to have died after vaccination. A 5-year-old boy from myocarditis and 7 and 9-year-olds from cardiac arrest, for example. And the TGA continues to maintain that the link between the vaccine and death is usually coincidental, not caused by the vaccine, and that these deaths are carefully reviewed for whether the vaccines could be the cause, and for the vast majority, that is not the case. So what is the process for this careful case report evaluation? The WHO Causality Assessment Manual provides the process and template for these causality assessments, and this involves considering, in this patient, is there another more likely confirmed cause for the event? Is there evidence in the published literature the vaccine may cause such an event? Is there a biological plausibility that the vaccine could cause such an event? And did the event occur in a plausible time window? Is there strong evidence against a causal relationship for the event? And the WHO provided flowchart and algorithm then follows to help classify the adverse event. So we can take this tragic report of death following vaccination in this 5-year-old boy, case number 734187, dated the 10th of May 2022. And the reported reaction following Pfizer vaccination is abdominal pain, cardiac arrest, eosinophilia, and eosinophilic myocarditis, with death as the reported outcome. And the causality assessment for this little boy has been released under Freedom of Information, FOI 4313. And we see that on the 13th of May 2022, there was a fatal adverse event following immunisation assessment team meeting, with several medical officers and others present, and much of the report is redacted. But we see there has been no referral to VSIG, the independent external safety body, despite this referral being required for all deaths. It appears that adequate information was available based on the Red Cross, and the decision outcome was WHO equals U. And we can compare this to the fatal AEFI meeting minutes for Natalie, a 21-year-old female whose death after Moderna vaccine is acknowledged by the TGA. And in this date-redacted meeting minute, the cross is marked on the algorithm as unclassifiable. The assessment is WHO equals U, and a referral to VSIG was made. Importantly, the VSIG meeting minutes from Natalie's case in September of 2022, which have been released under Freedom of Information, informs us that VSIG was convened to discuss the regulatory and program implications of a fatal case of myocarditis, and to consider the issue of public confidence, and to provide advice on public communication about the case. Importantly, VSIG was not convened to confirm causality. They do state that the panel agreed with the TGA's assessment that the death was likely related to vaccination. So what can be definitively stated about this careful causality assessment process? Firstly, that on the 25th of August 2022, the PSUR number 3 had been received by the TGA, as confirmed by written response to questions on notice, and that it was therefore known to the TGA at the latest by August of 2022 of reports confirmed by Pfizer of multiple deaths due to myocarditis and cardiac arrest in children, teenagers and young adults. And that the TGA had the report of death from a 5-year-old with eosinophilic myocarditis as a reported diagnosis, as well as several other cases of cardiac arrests and deaths in other young children and teenagers by this date. And secondly, we know that the information regarding numerous confirmed deaths in children by Pfizer was not communicated to the public or health professionals, and in fact that Pfizer assisted the FDA in resisting the release of this information to the public, and the TGA similarly denied freedom of information requests by myself and others to access these periodic safety update reports. Thirdly, that a multitude of potential safety signals have been requested by international regulators to be reviewed by Pfizer, including strokes, hearing loss, autoimmune disorders, and appendicitis, and these potential signals have not been communicated to health professionals. And this is a significant oversight with potential to interfere with safety monitoring and recording, as ordinarily the TGA will publish safety alerts and distribute these to prescribers, for example, when new adverse events or risks are identified with the product. Because if doctors do not know that an event is even a possible risk, they are more likely to simply dismiss it as impossible to be an adverse event and state that the vaccines do not cause appendicitis, deafness, strokes, or sudden deaths, etc., as doctors are accustomed to the product information containing these summaries of all adverse events reported during the trials and during the post-marketing surveillance. And only when alerted that such events are being investigated as possible signals will many doctors even consider these as potential adverse events and ensure the correct reporting of these to the TGA. This is both disempowering and distressing to potentially healthy patients who suddenly developed these conditions after vaccination, and it also compromises the safety reporting of adverse events. I personally would also consider it outrageous if that was my little child or teenager or relative who died of myocarditis or cardiac arrest or any reaction after vaccination, and the causality assessment summary was so seemingly inadequately performed without referral to the independent VC committee and without even a warning provided to the public. And particularly when myself and others had written to John Skerritt in 2021 warning of the reports of deaths and cardiac arrests in young people and requesting a suspension of the vaccines prior to the approval in children under 12 years. I hope this information may be useful to those who have experienced adverse events after vaccination. It may be helpful to share the PSUR or other information included in the links below with your health professional. It may assist your doctor to review the WHO Causality Assessment Manual template and flowchart, which may help in providing supportive evidence for those making claims under the Government Compensation Scheme, for joining the class action, or for commencing workers' compensation claims when the vaccination was a workplace recommendation or requirement.